Elena didn't know that the injured stranger she was treating in her small healing clinic was the most powerful alpha in the realm. She didn't know that his golden eyes had been searching for her across kingdoms, and she certainly didn't know that her trembling hands as she cleaned his wounds weren't from fear of his injuries, but from the way her soul recognized his. The wooden door to her clinic rattled against the storm outside, and Eleanor looked up from organizing her herb supplies. The border town of Millhaven rarely saw visitors after dark, especially during weather like this. Rain lashed the windows in sheets, and the wind howled through the narrow streets like a wounded animal. When the door burst open, Elena's breath caught. A man stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and bleeding from what looked like claw marks across his chest and shoulder. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and his clothes, fine quality despite being torn, clung to a frame that spoke of warrior training and inherent power. But it was his eyes that made Elena's hands shake as she reached for her medical supplies. Golden, impossibly golden, like molten amber catching firelight, and the way they found hers immediately, with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Please!" His voice was rough, strained with pain, but carrying an undertone of command that made her spine straighten instinctively. "I need—" "Sit," Elena interrupted, her healer instincts overriding everything else. She guided him to her examination table, trying to ignore the way warmth shot up her arm where their skin touched. "Don't talk, save your strength." He obeyed without question, which surprised her. Men with his obvious power rarely listened to anyone, especially not to nobody healers in forgotten border towns. But this stranger settled onto her table and watched her with those devastating golden eyes as she gathered what she needed. Elena's hands trembled as she cut away his shirt, revealing the full extent of his injuries. Deep gouges ran from his left shoulder down across his chest, too precise to be from any animal she knew. These were claws, but larger than any wolf or bear. Something supernatural had done this. "What attacked you?" she asked softly, beginning to clean the wounds with practiced efficiency. "Shadow wolves," he said, his voice tight with pain. "A pack of them, about 5 miles north of here." Elena's blood went cold. Shadow wolves were the stuff of nightmares, creatures that existed partially in the spirit realm and could tear through both flesh and soul. That this man had survived an encounter with a pack of them, let alone made it to her clinic alive, spoke of power she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But her fear was nothing compared to the strange warmth spreading through her chest as she worked. Every time her fingers brushed his skin, something in her responded, like a golden thread was being woven between them. She'd never felt anything like it, and it terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. "You're safe now," she murmured, applying a healing salve that would help the wounds close properly. "These will heal clean if you keep them dry and—" She looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. There was wonder in those golden eyes, and something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Elena." The word slipped out before she could think better of it. She rarely gave her real name to patients, had learned to be more careful after— She pushed the thought away and focused on bandaging his wounds. But she could feel his gaze on her face, studying her like she was something precious he'd been searching for. "Elena," he repeated, and her name sounded different in his voice. Cherished. "Thank you." When she finished with the bandages, she started to step back, but his hand moved to catch hers gently. The moment their skin touched, fire raced through her veins and she gasped. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, releasing her hand. "I didn't mean to startle you." But Eleanor wasn't startled by his touch. She was overwhelmed by how right it felt, how safe, how perfectly her hand had fit in his despite the obvious strength there. It reminded her of things she'd thought she'd never want again, things that belonged to a different life before she'd learned to be afraid. "I should check if you need stitches," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His golden eyes softened. May I? The question confused her until he lifted his hand slowly, telegraphing his intention to touch her face, to brush away the tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Panic shot through her like lightning. Her past, her fears, everything she'd run from crashed over her in a wave of terror. She jerked backwards so violently she nearly knocked over her supply cart. "Please!" The word tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "I'm not ready!" The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor wanted to disappear. Here was this magnificent stranger who had looked at her like she was something precious, and she was falling apart at the mere suggestion of gentle touch. But instead of anger or confusion, his face filled with something that looked like understanding. He lowered his hand immediately and took a careful step back, giving her space to breathe. "I'll be right here," he said softly, settling into the chair beside her examination table. Not leaving, but not pressuring her either. Just present, available, patient. Eleanor's breathing slowly returned to normal as she watched him. He made no move to explain away her reaction, didn't demand to know what was wrong with her, didn't act like her fear was an inconvenience or something to be overcome with persistence. He simply stayed. "I have tea," she offered quietly, needing something normal to anchor herself to. "I'd like that very much." As Elena busied herself with the kettle, she snuck glances at her unexpected patient. He sat perfectly still, those golden eyes following her movements, but never making her feel hunted or trapped. There was something almost protective in his stillness, like he was standing guard against whatever shadows had taught her to flinch from kindness. "The storm's getting worse," she said, more to fill the silence than because it needed saying. "Yes." His voice was warm, patient. "I may need to wait it out if that's all right with you." Elena nodded, surprised by how much she wanted him to stay. Despite her panic, despite her fear, there was something about this stranger that made her feel safer than she had in years. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why every cell in her body seemed to recognize him. But as she prepared tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking, Elena found herself hoping the storm would last all night. Because for the first time since she'd learned to be afraid, she didn't want to be alone. Elena woke to the sound of quiet movement in her clinic. For a moment, panic seized her. Someone was in her space, her sanctuary. But then she remembered. The stranger. The storm. The golden-eyed man who had promised to be right there. She found him exactly where she'd left him, still sitting in that same chair beside her examination table. But he wasn't sleeping. He was awake, alert, watching her small living space above the clinic with those impossibly golden eyes that seemed to see everything. "You stayed," she whispered, surprised by the relief in her own voice. "I said I would." His voice was warm, rough with the remnants of sleep he probably hadn't gotten. "How are you feeling?" Elena took stock. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart wasn't racing. The familiar knot of anxiety in her chest had loosened sometime during the night, replaced by something she couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously like peace. "Better," she admitted. "You should have been uncomfortable in that chair all night. I've slept in worse places." He gestured to her small kitchen table, where Eleanor noticed a cloth bundle she hadn't seen before. "I took the liberty of acquiring breakfast and some supplies for your clinic. I hope that's all right." Elena approached the bundle cautiously. Inside, she found fresh bread, honey, tea that smelled expensive, and medical supplies that must have cost more than she made in a month. Her healer's eyes immediately catalogued rare herbs, silk bandages, and vials of medicine she'd only dreamed of having. "How did you—" She stopped. There was only one shop in Millhaven that carried supplies like these, and old Henrik would never have opened before dawn unless someone had paid him extraordinarily well. "Who are you?" Something shifted in those golden eyes. Not fear exactly, but wariness, like he was calculating how much truth she could handle. "My name is Darius," he said carefully. Eleanor waited, but he didn't continue. "That's not what I asked." The sound of hoofbeats outside made them both freeze. Multiple horses, riding hard despite the muddy roads left by the storm. Eleanor's blood went cold. Riders at dawn meant trouble in a town like Millhaven. Trouble meant questions she wasn't ready to answer. But Darius had gone perfectly still in a way that spoke of predator instincts and danger. When the horses stopped outside her clinic, he moved to the window with fluid grace that belonged to someone accustomed to violence. "Damn!" he breathed. Elena joined him at the window, her heart sinking at what she saw. 6 mounted men in armour that gleamed despite the mud, their tabards bearing a crest she recognised from stories told in hushed whispers. The Golden Wolf of the Northern Territories, the Alpha King's men. "They're looking for someone," Elena whispered, fear making her voice tight. "They'll search every building. You need to hide." "Elena." Darius's hand touched her shoulder, warm and steady. When she looked at him, his golden eyes held something that looked like regret. "They're looking for me." The words didn't make sense at first. Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying, when the truth hit her like a physical blow. The golden eyes, the way he moved, the fine clothes beneath the tears, the way even shadow wolves hadn't been able to kill him. The supplies that cost a fortune, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority even when bleeding and hurt. "Oh God!" Elena's legs gave out, and she sank into her kitchen chair. "You're him. You're the Alpha King." Darius, no, King Darius, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms, nodded slowly. Yes. Eleanor's mind reeled. The Alpha King, in her clinic. She had touched the Alpha King. She had ordered him to sit still and save his strength. She had... Panic rose in her throat like bile. This was worse than anything she had imagined. She wasn't just Nobody Eleanor the healer anymore. She was Nobody Eleanor who had somehow caught the attention of the most dangerous man alive. Just like before. Just like with... "Elena?" Darius's voice was gentle, careful. "Breathe." But Elena couldn't breathe. Her past rose up to choke her. Marcus had been powerful too, had used that power to trap her, to hurt her, to make her believe she belonged to him simply because he wanted her. And now, someone with 100 times that power was in her clinic, looking at her with those golden eyes like she was something precious he intended to claim. "Please," she gasped, I can't do this again." "Do what again?" Darius asked quietly, but Elena was already backing toward the door. "The power, the control, I escaped it once, I can't." A knock on the clinic door made them both freeze. "Your Majesty," came a voice Elena recognised as Captain Morrison from the stories. "We tracked your scent here. Are you safe?" Darius never took his eyes off Elena's face. "I'm perfectly safe, Captain. Give me a moment." "Your Majesty, with respect, you've been missing all night. The council is in uproar, and there are reports of shadow wolf attacks." "I said give me a moment." The command in Darius's voice was unmistakable, the tone of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Captain Morrison fell silent immediately. But that tone, that power, sent Elena's panic spiralling higher. This was what she had feared. This was who he really was beneath the patient gentleness. A man who commanded with absolute authority, who expected obedience without question, just like Marcus. "Elena, look at me." Darius's voice had returned to that careful gentleness, but Elena couldn't unhear the command he'd given his captain. "Please." She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see the cold calculation she remembered from Marcus, the look that said she was a possession to be claimed, a prize to be won. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch. Fear, not of her, but for her. King Darius, the Alpha King who commanded armies and ruled kingdoms, was afraid that he had frightened her. "I don't care about titles or power when I'm with you," he said softly. "I only care that you feel safe." Elena stared at him. "You're the Alpha King. You could take anything you wanted." "Yes." His voice was steady, honest. "And what I want is for you to never be afraid of me." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Your Majesty, please, the border lords are gathering, and there are rumours." Captain Morrison, Darius called without looking away from Elena. I need you to return to the capital and inform the council that I am safe and will return when my business here is concluded. Your Majesty, we cannot leave you unguarded. That is an order. Elena flinched at the absolute authority in those words, but then Darius did something that stopped her short. He sat down. Not stood tall to emphasize his power, not moved closer to intimidate her into submission. He sat down, making himself smaller, less threatening. May I ask them to leave? He said to Elena. His voice returned to that careful gentleness. If their presence makes you uncomfortable, I'll send them away. Elena blinked. You're asking my permission? In all things, Darius said simply. Always. It was such a foreign concept that Elena couldn't quite grasp it at first. Marcus had never asked permission for anything. He had taken what he wanted and justified it later. But here was the most powerful man alive, asking her permission to dismiss his own guards. Yes, she managed. Please. Darius nodded and raised his voice. Captain, you have your orders. Return to the capital. I'll follow within the week. But your Majesty, Captain. The warning in that single word was unmistakable. Elena heard the sound of reluctant departure, horses being mounted, the fading sound of hoofbeats as the royal guard left without their king. When silence fell again, Elena stared at Darius in confusion. You sent away your protection. For me. You were afraid of them, he said simply, more afraid than you were before they came. I won't have you frightened in your own home. Elena's world tilted. But you could have commanded me to... To what? Darius's golden eyes were steady on hers. To stop being afraid, to pretend their presence didn't bother you. What would be the point of that? Elena had no answer. Marcus would have done exactly that, ordered her to get over it, to adjust, to bend herself around his needs and his power. But Darius had sent away his own men, had potentially put himself in danger, just to ease her fear. I don't understand you, she whispered. Darius smiled, and it transformed his entire face. That's all right. We have time. Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. Do we? As much time as you need, he said. I told you, Elena, I'll be right here. Elena studied his face, looking for the lie, for the manipulation, for the hidden cost she knew had to exist. Men like Marcus always had conditions, always had prices that came due when you least expected them. But all she saw in those golden eyes was patience and something deeper. Something that looked almost like, why? She asked. You're a king. You could have anyone. Why would you wait for someone like me? Someone like you? Darius repeated, his voice soft. Eleanor, you're the bravest person I've ever met. Eleanor laughed, but there was no humour in it. I'm terrified of everything. You're terrified, he agreed, and yet you helped a dangerous stranger in the middle of the night. You cleaned wounds that could have killed you if I'd been something else. You offered tea to someone who could overpower you without effort. That's not cowardice, Elena. That's courage. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever called her brave before. Marcus had called her weak, pathetic, useful only for what she could provide him. But this man, this king, looked at her like she was something rare and precious. It was terrifying and wonderful and absolutely impossible. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? Trust someone with power. Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his travel pack and pulled out something that made Eleanor's breath catch. A crown, simple, elegant, and unmistakably royal. The symbol of absolute power over 3 kingdoms. Elena watched in stunned silence as he set it on her kitchen table and pushed it away from himself. Then don't trust the power, he said quietly. Trust the man who's choosing to set it aside. The days that followed were a strange rhythm Elena had never experienced before. Each morning, she would wake to find Darius already up, sitting in that same chair with a cup of tea, prepared and fresh supplies arranged on her counter. Not presumptuous supplies, but things she'd mentioned needing in passing conversation. a particular herb for pain relief, clean bandages that wouldn't irritate sensitive skin, small comforts that showed he listened to every word she spoke. He never asked to stay, never presumed. Each evening he would quietly inquire if she would prefer he find lodgings in town, and each evening Elena found herself shaking her head. Not because she was afraid of being alone, she'd been alone for years, but because his presence had become something she looked forward to rather than endured. It was unprecedented and terrifying. "You don't have to help," Elena said on the third morning, watching as Darius organised her medical supplies with the precision of someone who understood their importance. His hands were careful, respectful of her system, rather than imposing his own. "I know," he replied simply. "I want to." Elena studied his profile as he worked. The strong jaw, the golden eyes that seemed to catch every nuance of light, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size. She'd treated enough warriors to recognize the signs. This was a man trained for violence, built for it. Yet those same hands that could probably crush stone were arranging her delicate glass vials like they were made of precious crystal. "May I ask you something?" Darius said, not looking up from his task. Elena tensed automatically. Questions meant probing, meant someone wanting to know things she'd spent years learning to keep hidden. But Darius had asked permission first, the way he did for everything. "All right. You flinch sometimes when I move too quickly," he observed quietly, "and yesterday, when that merchant raised his voice to his wife, you went pale as winter snow. Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bandages she was counting. I can't. "You don't have to tell me," Darius said gently. "I was simply going to say that whoever it was, he was a fool who didn't recognize treasure when he held it." Eleanor's breath caught. The certainty in his voice, the way he spoke of her worth like it was an undeniable fact rather than something she had to earn, made something crack open in her chest. "His name was Marcus," she heard herself say. The words felt rusty, like she hadn't spoken them in years, because she hadn't. "Lord Marcus Aldwyn. I was engaged to him." Darius's hands stilled completely, but he didn't turn to look at her. Somehow his continued focus on the supplies made it easier to continue. "He was powerful, not like you," she added quickly, "but enough to make people look the other way when he decided I needed to be taught lessons about obedience." Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said I belonged to him, that because he wanted me, I owed him everything, my body, my thoughts, my complete submission to his will. And when I didn't give it freely—" She touched her ribs unconsciously, where old breaks had healed crooked. Darius's stillness had taken on a different quality. Elena could feel the leashed power radiating from him. The careful control he was exerting over what she suspected was murderous rage. "How did you escape?" His voice was steady, but Elena caught the underlying fury. "I ran." Elena laughed, but there was no humour in it. "In the middle of the night, like a thief. I took nothing but the clothes on my back and my healer's training, and I ran until I found somewhere he wouldn't think to look for me." "He was a coward," Darius said quietly, finally turning to face her. His golden eyes blazed with protective fury, but his voice remained gentle. "A man who would hurt someone smaller, someone vulnerable, someone who trusted him. He's not a man at all. He's a monster wearing a man's face." Eleanor stared at him. She'd expected judgment, or pity, or that particular kind of male anger that was really about possession rather than protection. Instead, she saw something in Darius's eyes that made her chest tight. Understanding and pain that wasn't his own. "You've been alone," she realized. "Not just unmarried, alone." Something flickered across Darius's face. The crown doesn't make for easy companionship. People want things from kings: power, influence, advantage. They rarely want the man beneath the crown. Elena found herself studying his face with new eyes. She'd been so focused on his power, His authority, that she'd missed the loneliness. The careful way he held himself apart, even from his own guards. The way he seemed surprised by every small kindness she showed him. "Is that why you haven't chosen a queen?" she asked softly. Darius smiled, but it was edged with old pain. "I've been waiting for someone who would see me before they saw my crown. Someone who would choose me, not my power." Elena's heart did something complicated. "I'm afraid of your power." "I know." He moved closer, slowly, telegraphing his intention. When she didn't flinch away, he settled onto the stool beside her work counter, bringing them to eye level. "But you still made me tea that first night. You still let me help with your work. You still ask me how I slept and whether I prefer honey or jam with breakfast. You see the man, Elena, even when you're afraid of the king." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't realized she'd been doing those things, caring for him in small ways. It had felt natural, right? Like something her soul demanded rather than her mind decided. "I don't know how to trust this," she whispered. "Trust what?" "You. This." She gestured helplessly between them. "The way you make me feel like I'm worth something." Darius reached toward her face, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. "May I?" Eleanor's instinct was to pull away, to protect herself from the vulnerability that came with gentle touch. But something in his golden eyes, some combination of patience and longing, made her nod. His fingers brushed her cheek so softly she almost couldn't feel it. Just the whisper of contact, warm and careful and utterly non-threatening. "You are worth everything," he said quietly. "Not because I say so, because it's true." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. When was the last time someone had touched her face with tenderness instead of anger? When was the last time someone had spoken to her like she was precious instead of useful? A commotion outside made them both freeze. Raised voices, the sound of someone shouting. Elena immediately pulled away from Darius's touch, her old instincts flaring to life. "Stay here," Darius said, rising smoothly to his feet. "No." Elena caught his arm before he could reach the door. It might be dangerous. Darius looked down at her hand on his arm, and Elena realized what she'd done. She'd reached for him. She'd touched him first, had put herself between him and potential danger, despite being terrified of violence. "I can handle danger, Elena," he said gently, "but I appreciate you wanting to protect me." The shouting grew louder, and Elena recognized one of the voices. Thomas Brennan, a farmer whose wife she'd treated for fever the week before. But he sounded wrong, angry and afraid in equal measure. "Please," she said to Darius, "let me come with you. If someone's hurt, they might need a healer." Darius studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Stay behind me." They opened the clinic door to find a small crowd gathered around Thomas, who was restraining his teenage son with obvious effort. The boy, barely 16, was thrashing and snarling like an animal, his eyes wild with something that wasn't entirely human. "He was helping with the harvest," Thomas was saying to anyone who would listen. "Then he just changed, started acting like some kind of beast. I don't know what's wrong with him." Elena's blood went cold. She'd seen symptoms like this before, in the medical texts she'd studied during her training, but it was impossible. Shadow wolf infection was supposed to be fatal. "Elena," Darius said quietly, his voice holding a warning she didn't understand. That's when she saw the man standing at the edge of the crowd, tall, well-dressed despite the early hour, with pale eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He was watching the infected boy with the sort of clinical interest that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Fascinating," the stranger murmured, loudly enough for several people to hear. "I've never seen a shadow wolf infection that didn't kill immediately. The boy must have unusual resilience." "Shadow wolf?" Thomas's face went white. "That's not possible. Those things are just stories." "Oh, they're quite real," the stranger said smoothly, "and quite deadly, though it appears your son might be the first to survive the initial bite. How remarkable." Eleanor felt Darius tense beside her, his protective instincts clearly triggered. but she was too focused on the boy to worry about strange men with calculating eyes. "Thomas," she called out, "bring him to my clinic. I might be able to help." The stranger's pale eyes fixed on her with sudden, intense interest. A healer who thinks she can cure shadow wolf infection. How ambitious. Something in his tone made Eleanor step closer to Darius without thinking about it. Her body recognized a threat even if her mind couldn't identify it yet, but before she could analyze the feeling, young Brennan broke free of his father's grip and lunged directly at Elena with inhuman speed and strength. Elena froze, terror locking her muscles. This was it. She was going to die because she'd tried to help, just like Marcus had always said she would. Darius moved like liquid lightning. One moment Eleanor was staring at snapping teeth and wild eyes. The next she was safely behind Darius's broad back while he held the infected boy at arm's length with what looked like effortless strength. "Elena," Darius said calmly, not even breathing hard despite restraining someone with supernatural strength, "I need you to talk me through treating shadow wolf infection." Elena's mind went blank. She was pressed against Darius's back, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the controlled power in his frame. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry at her for putting them both in danger. He was simply handling it. I don't know if it can be treated," she stammered. "Then we'll figure it out together," Darius said. "You're the smartest person I know, Elena. What would you try first?" The confidence in his voice, the absolute certainty that she could handle this, cut through Eleanor's panic like a blade. Her healer's training reasserted itself, and she began to think instead of fear. "See, silver nitrate solution," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And moonflower extract if I have any left. They're both purifying agents." "Excellent. Thomas, help me get your son to Elena's table." As they manoeuvred the still struggling boy toward her clinic, Elena caught sight of the pale-eyed stranger again. He was watching her now with an expression she didn't like at all, like she'd just become far more interesting to him than was safe. But Darius was there, solid and protective at her back, asking her opinion and trusting her expertise. For the first time in years, Elena felt like she might not have to face the world's dangers alone, and that terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. Elena should have known that 3 days of peace was too good to last. She was grinding moonflower petals into powder when the clinic door slammed open with enough force to rattle the glass vials on her shelves. The man who strode inside made Eleanor's blood turn to ice in her veins. Marcus. Lord Marcus Aldwyn, in all his cruel, handsome glory, looking exactly as she remembered from her nightmares. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the kind of classically attractive features that made people trust him before they knew better. Behind him came 2 guards in his family colours, and Elena's world tilted sideways. He'd found her. After 3 years of hiding, of building a new life, of learning to breathe again, he'd found her. "There you are, my dear," Marcus said, his voice carrying that same cultured tone that had once fooled her into thinking he was a gentleman. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Elena's hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped the mortar and pestle. Every carefully built wall of courage crumbled in an instant, leaving her feeling like the terrified, broken girl she'd been when she fled his estate in the dead of night. You can't—" The words wouldn't come. Her voice had disappeared along with her newfound strength. "Can't what?" Marcus stepped closer, and Elena's body remembered every lesson he'd taught her about what happened when she displeased him. "Can't reclaim my runaway bride. Can't collect what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to you." Darius's voice cut through the clinic like a blade, low and deadly and vibrating with barely controlled fury. Elena's heart lurched. She'd been so focused on Marcus that she hadn't even noticed Darius return from his morning walk. Now he stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his golden eyes blazing with protective rage that made the air itself seem to shimmer with danger. Marcus turned, taking in Darius's presence with calculating eyes. Elena watched in horror as Marcus's gaze moved from Darius's expensive but simple clothes to his commanding presence, to the way he positioned himself squarely between Marcus and Elena. "And you are?" Marcus inquired with false politeness. "Someone who doesn't take kindly to men who terrorize women," Darius replied evenly. Marcus laughed, the sound making Elena flinch. "Terrorize? My dear fellow, I think you misunderstand the situation. Elena is my betrothed. She ran away from our wedding in a fit of pre-nuptial nerves, but I've come to bring her home where she belongs." "That's not—" Elena tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat like thorns. "Not what?" Marcus turned back to her, and Eleanor saw the flash of cruel satisfaction in his eyes. He knew exactly what his presence was doing to her, and he was enjoying it. "Not the truth? Elena, darling, surely you're not going to lie to your new friend about our arrangement?" Elena's breath came in short, desperate gasps. She wanted to scream, to tell Darius that there had been no arrangement, only Marcus's assumption that he could take what he wanted. But the panic was rising in her throat like a tide, drowning her voice, making her feel small and powerless and worthless all over again. "Eleanor." Darius's voice was gentle but firm, cutting through the chaos in her mind. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his golden eyes, and the steady warmth there gave her something to anchor herself to. "Is what he says true?" Darius asked quietly. "Are you betrothed to this man?" Elena shook her head frantically. I ended when I left." "She's overwrought," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "The poor dear has clearly been living rough, and it's affected her thinking. Elena, love, you know our families signed the contracts. You know you gave me your word." "I never," Elena's voice cracked. "I never wanted. You hurt me." "Discipline is not the same as harm," Marcus said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that had always made Elena feel like she was losing her mind. "A man has the right to guide his future wife's behaviour. Elena simply needed more guidance than most." The words hit Elena like physical blows. This was what she'd run from, this ability Marcus had to twist everything, to make his cruelty sound reasonable, to make her feel like she was the one who was wrong, broken, inadequate. "You will never touch her again." The words came from Darius in a tone Eleanor had never heard before. Not the careful gentleness he used with her, not even the commanding voice he'd used with his guards. This was something else entirely. This was the voice of a predator who had just identified a threat to his mate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's confident smile faltered as he really looked at Darius for the first time. Elena watched as Marcus's eyes widened slightly, taking in details he'd missed before. The unconscious authority in Darius's stance, the way his guards had stepped back instinctively, the golden eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. "Who exactly are you?" Marcus asked, and for the first time uncertainty crept into his voice. "I am King Darius of the Northern Territories," Darius replied, his voice carrying absolute authority. "And the woman you are threatening is under my protection." The blood drained from Marcus's face. Even his guards looked ready to bolt. Elena felt a moment of vicious satisfaction watching Marcus's arrogance crumble as he realized exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Your Majesty," Marcus stammered, attempting a bow that came off as more of an undignified stumble. "I had no idea. If I had known you were—" "Terrorizing an innocent woman," Darius finished coldly. "Yes, that does tend to be more difficult when there are witnesses of sufficient rank to hold you accountable." Elena watched in fascination as Marcus's mask slipped completely. Gone was the cultured lord, replaced by the snarling, entitled brat he'd always been beneath the veneer of respectability. "She's nothing," Marcus spat, his true nature finally showing. "A nobody healer from a nobody family, whatever hold she thinks she has on you." Marcus never finished the sentence. One moment he was standing, the next he was pinned against Elena's clinic wall with Darius's hand around his throat. Elena hadn't even seen Darius move. "Let me make something very clear," Darius said in that same deadly quiet tone. "Elena is not nothing. She is precious beyond measure, and she is mine to protect. If you ever speak of her that way again, I will forget that I am supposed to be a civilized king." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her was terrified by the display of violence, by the reminder of exactly how much power Darius possessed. But another part, a part she barely recognized, felt a dark thrill at watching Marcus finally face consequences for his cruelty. "Do you understand me?" Darius continued. Marcus nodded frantically, his face turning purple from lack of air. Darius released him, and Marcus collapsed to the floor, gasping. "Take your men and leave this territory," Darius commanded. "If I see you within 100 miles of Elena again, I will consider it an act of war against my kingdom." "You can't. The marriage contracts, my family's honor." "Your family's honor." Darius laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A man who abuses women has no honor. Your marriage contracts are void. Elena owes you nothing." Marcus struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he snarled, looking directly at Elena. "You think you can hide behind your new protector forever? Kings get bored of their toys, Elena, and when he does, I'll be waiting." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt all her newfound courage crumble. Because Marcus was right, wasn't he? What was she to a king except a temporary diversion? Darius would return to his kingdom eventually, and she would be alone again, vulnerable again. "Get out," Darius said, his voice promising violence if Marcus lingered another second. Marcus and his guards fled, but the damage was done. Elena stood frozen in the middle of her clinic, Marcus's words echoing in her mind. Temporary. Toy. A diversion for a powerful man who would eventually grow bored and move on. "Elena." Darius approached her slowly, hands raised peacefully. "Are you all right?" Elena laughed, but it came out broken and harsh. "Am I all right? You just had to threaten a lord to protect me. You had to use your crown, your power, your authority. I'm exactly what I was before. Someone who needs protecting, someone who can't stand on her own." "That's not true," Darius said firmly. "Isn't it?" Elena's voice rose, fear and shame making her reckless. "I couldn't even speak when he was here. I just stood there like a terrified child while you fought my battles for me. And he's right. You're a king. What am I except a temporary distraction?" "Eleanor." "How long?" she interrupted, desperation making her cruel. "How long before you get bored of playing protector to broken Elena the healer? How long before you remember that you need a queen, not a charity case?" The words hung between them like a blade. Darius stared at her, something that looked like pain flickering across his features. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked quietly. "Charity?" Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the day. "What else could it be?" Darius was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Elena, I would rather spend my life protecting you from the shadows than spend a single day on a throne without you beside me." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching his golden eyes for the lie, for the manipulation, for the conditions that always came with declarations like that. All she saw was truth, and a love so deep it took her breath away. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. "Then don't," Darius said simply. "Not yet, but let me prove it to you. However long it takes, however much patience it requires, let me show you that some men keep their promises." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. Part of her wanted to believe him desperately, but Marcus's words still echoed in her mind, poisonous and familiar. "What if he's right?" she asked. "What if you change your mind?" Darius stepped closer, slowly, carefully, until he was close enough to touch her face if she'd let him. "Then I would be the greatest fool who ever lived," he said quietly, "and I would deserve to spend eternity regretting the loss of the most precious thing I'd ever been given." Elena's breath caught. The absolute certainty in his voice, the way he looked at her like she truly was precious, made something crack open in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know." Darius's smile was gentle, understanding. "But I'm not going anywhere, Elena, no matter how scared you get, no matter how many times you need me to prove myself. I'll be right here." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the truth of those words settle into her bones like warmth. For the first time since Marcus had stormed into her clinic, she felt like she could breathe again. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to believe in forever. Eleanor spent the longest night of her life staring at the ceiling above her small bed, her mind churning with everything that had happened. Marcus's cruel words, Darius's fierce protection, the way her heart had cracked open when Darius said he would rather protect her than rule without her. But it was the quiet moments after Marcus left that haunted her most. The way Darius had sat in his chair, giving her space to process, never pushing for gratitude or reassurance that she was all right, just present, patient, exactly as he'd promised to be. When dawn finally crept through her windows, Eleanor made her way downstairs to find Darius's chair empty. His travel pack sat beside it, neatly organised, as if he'd been preparing to leave. Eleanor's heart stopped. She found him outside the clinic, loading supplies into saddlebags with the efficient movements of someone who had done this countless times before. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones, and everything felt surreal, dreamlike, as if she were watching her worst fears come to life. "You're leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Darius turned, and the pain in his golden eyes nearly brought Elena to her knees. "I think it might be best." "Best for who?" "For you." Darius set down the bag he'd been holding and faced her fully. "Yesterday proved that my presence puts you in danger. Marcus found you because of me, because of the attention my guards brought to this town, and he was right about one thing. I can't stay here forever. I have a kingdom to rule." Elena felt something fracture in her chest. "So that's it? You're just going?" "Eleanor." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a goodbye all at once. "You deserve peace. You deserve to heal without having to worry about what my crown brings to your doorstep. Marcus won't dare return now that he knows who I am, and you'll be safe to build the life you want." "The life I want?" Elena's voice cracked. "What if the life I want includes you?" Darius went perfectly still. "Elena, no, let me finish." Elena took a step closer, then another, until she was close enough to see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes. "Yesterday, when Marcus was threatening me, I felt small and powerless and broken, but not because you weren't protecting me enough, because I was letting him make me feel that way." Darius watched her carefully, hope and caution warring in his expression. "I've been so afraid of being controlled that I was controlling myself right out of happiness," Elena continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You've never tried to change me, or fix me, or make me into something I'm not. You've just seen me, the real me, and somehow that was enough." "More than enough," Darius said softly. "Elena, you're— Wait." Elena held up a hand, and to her amazement Darius fell silent immediately. Even now, even as he was preparing to leave her, he yielded to her wishes. "Please, I'm not ready." Darius's face went carefully blank. "I understand. If you need more time—" "No." Elena took another step closer, close enough to touch him if she dared. "I'm not ready for you to leave." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Darius stared at her, and Elena saw the exact moment he understood what she was saying, what she was choosing. "Elena," he breathed, "are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, Elena reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. Darius went absolutely still beneath her touch, as if he were afraid that moving might shatter the spell. "I realized something last night," Elena said quietly. "Marcus made me afraid of taking up space, of asking for what I wanted, of believing I deserved good things. But you make me feel like I'm allowed to want, like I'm allowed to choose." "What do you choose?" Darius asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor's answer was to rise up on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was soft, hesitant, a question more than a statement. But Darius responded with a gentleness that made Eleanor's heart sing, his hands coming up to frame her face like she was made of spun glass. When they broke apart, Eleanor was breathless. "I choose you," she whispered. "I choose this. I choose us." Something broke open in Darius's expression, and suddenly Elena found herself swept up in his arms, held against his chest like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice muffled against her hair. "Elena, once you're mine, I won't let you go. I can't. You're too important, too precious. I would move kingdoms to keep you safe." Elena felt the mate bond flare to life between them, that golden thread she'd sensed from the beginning, finally acknowledged and accepted. It felt like coming home and falling in love and finding herself all at once. "I'm ready," she said, meaning it completely. "I'm ready to be yours. But Darius?" "Anything. I need you to be mine too, not just the king, not just the protector. All of you." Darius pulled back to look at her, his golden eyes blazing with something that took Elena's breath away. "I've been yours since the moment I walked through that door, bleeding and broken, and you touched me like I was worth healing." Elena felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears this time. Happy tears. "I was so afraid of being possessed, but this doesn't feel like possession. It feels like partnership." "That's because it is," Darius said firmly. "Eleanor, I don't want to rule over you. I want to rule beside you. I want you as my equal, my partner, my queen." "Your queen?" Elena's voice squeaked. Darius laughed, the sound rich and warm and full of joy. "If you'll have me, if you'll let me spend my life proving that some fairy tales do come true." Elena thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, running through the darkness with nothing but fear and desperation driving her forward. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, strong enough to heal others, brave enough to risk her heart on a love that felt too good to be true. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Darius kissed her again, deeper this time, with all the passion and tenderness and fierce devotion Elena had never dared to dream she could inspire in another person. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you," Darius said against her lips. "I love your courage, your kindness, your healing hands and generous heart. I love the way you see people's pain and want to fix it. I love how you flinch from power but stand up to protect others anyway." Elena's heart felt too big for her chest. "I love you too. I love your patience, your gentleness, the way you make me feel safe enough to be myself. I love that you're strong enough to protect me, but wise enough to let me protect myself." "We're going to be so happy," Darius murmured, resting his forehead against hers. Elena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Are we really doing this? Are we really going to try to make this work?" "We're not going to try," Darius said with absolute certainty. "We're going to succeed. You and me, Elena, partners, equals, forever." Elena looked into his golden eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not a perfect future without challenges or fears, but a future where she wouldn't have to face anything alone. A future where she was chosen and cherished and valued, not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. "Forever," she agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. As the morning sun burned away the mist, Eleanor felt something she thought was lost forever finally return to her heart. Hope. Not just for today or tomorrow, but for all the days stretching out ahead of them. She was ready for whatever came next. They both were. Together. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the gardens of the Northern Palace, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The healing centre she'd established in the palace grounds was already bustling with activity, despite the early hour. Healers she'd trained worked alongside palace physicians, treating everyone from noble courtiers to common farmers with equal care and skill. It was everything she dreamed of, and more. "Good morning, my queen." Elena turned to find Darius approaching with 2 steaming cups of tea and a smile that still made her heart skip. Even after months of marriage, months of waking up beside him every morning, she sometimes couldn't quite believe this was her life. "Good morning, my king," she replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "How did the council meeting go?" "Better, now that they've realised you're not going anywhere." Darius settled beside her on the stone bench, his warmth immediately chasing away the morning chill. "Lord Whitmore actually complimented the new trade agreements you negotiated with the southern provinces." Elena laughed. "Lord Whitmore thinks women should be seen and not heard. That must have killed him." "I believe his exact words were, 'Her Majesty has a surprisingly astute mind for commerce,'" Darius said with a grin. "I told him there was nothing surprising about it to anyone who'd been paying attention." Elena leaned into her husband's side, marvelling at how natural the gesture had become. There had been difficult days in those first months, moments when her old fears would surface, when she'd catch herself waiting for Darius to change, to become demanding or controlling. But he never had. If anything, marriage had only made him more determined to prove that love could be patient, that power could protect without possessing. Eleanor. A young voice interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Sarah, one of the junior healers, approaching nervously. "There's a woman here requesting to see you specifically. She says she heard there was a queen who understands what it means to run." Elena's heart clenched. Even here, even surrounded by safety and love, the women still found her. They came from all corners of the kingdoms, drawn by stories of the healer queen who had escaped her own darkness and lived to build something beautiful. "Of course," Elena said, rising immediately. "Where is she?" "In the small treatment room. She's in rough shape, Your Majesty, bruised, terrified. She flinches every time someone moves too quickly." Elena felt Darius tense beside her, his protective instincts flaring. After 6 months of marriage, he'd learned to recognize the signs of women who had survived what Eleanor had survived. His rage on their behalf was always swift and absolute. "I'll come with you," he said quietly. Eleanor touched his hand gently. "Let me go first, alone. You know how they react to male authority figures, even kind ones." Darius nodded, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to step back. "I'll be in my study if you need me." Eleanor made her way to the small treatment room, her heart breaking at the sight that greeted her. The woman couldn't have been more than 20, with long brown hair that had been roughly chopped short and healing bruises along her jawline that spoke of recent violence. She sat hunched in on herself, wearing clothes that were too large and clearly borrowed. "Hello," Elena said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm Elena. Sarah said you wanted to speak with me." The woman's eyes, a startling shade of green, fixed on Elena's face with desperate hope. "You're really her, the queen who ran from—" "Yes," Elena said simply. "I ran, and I survived, and eventually I learned to live again." The woman's composure cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "Everyone said I was crazy. They said Lord Garrett was a good man, that I should be grateful he wanted to marry me. But he hurt me. And when I tried to tell someone, they said I was ungrateful, that I didn't understand what marriage meant." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. Different name, same story. Different woman, same suffering. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked gently. "Mira, Lady Mira Thornton, or I was, until I ran." "Well, Mira," Elena said, rising to pour tea from the pot Sarah had left. "You're safe now, and you're not crazy. You're brave." "I don't feel brave. I feel broken." Elena handed Mira the teacup, noting how the woman's hands shook as she accepted it. "I used to think those were the same thing, broken and cowardly. But I learned something important. Sometimes breaking is the only way to reshape yourself into someone stronger." Mira looked up at her with those green eyes full of fragile hope. How did you do it? How did you learn to trust again? Eleanor settled back in her chair, thinking of Darius's patient smile, his gentle hands, the way he'd spent months proving that love could heal instead of harm. Very slowly, Elena said honestly, and with someone who understood that healing can't be rushed, someone who was willing to earn my trust instead of demanding it. The king? Elena nodded. He taught me that there's a difference between power that protects and power that possesses, between someone who wants to own you and someone who wants to stand beside you. Mira was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea. Do you think someone like me could ever find that? Someone who's as broken as I am? Elena's heart ached for this young woman, for all the women who'd sat in chairs like this one, asking variations of the same question. Am I worthy of love? Am I too damaged? Is there hope for someone like me? Mira, Elena said firmly, you are not broken, you are wounded, and wounds can heal, especially when they're tended with care. But what if I never stop being afraid? What if I never learn to trust? Elena leaned forward, holding Mira's gaze. Then you'll learn to be afraid and trust anyway. That's what courage really is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to choose love despite it. Mira's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these looked different, hopeful. Will you help me? Mira asked quietly. I don't have anywhere else to go, and I heard the Queen takes in women like me. Women like us, Elena corrected gently. And yes, you can stay as long as you need, work in the healing centre if you'd like, or simply rest and recover. No expectations, no conditions, just safety and time to remember who you are beneath the fear. For the first time since Eleanor had entered the room, Mira smiled. Elena spent the rest of the morning helping Mira settle into her new quarters, introducing her to other women who'd found sanctuary in the palace. By the time she returned to the royal wing, the sun was high overhead, and Darius was waiting for her with barely contained patience. How is she? He asked immediately. Surviving, Elena said, settling into his arms with a sigh. She'll heal. They all do, given enough time and safety. And you? How are you? Elena looked up at her husband, this man who'd taught her that love could be gentle, that power could serve instead of dominate, that healing was possible even for hearts that felt irreparably broken. I'm happy, she said, meaning it completely. I'm exactly where I belong. Darius kissed the top of her head, and Eleanor felt that familiar warmth spread through her chest, the golden thread that bound them together, stronger now than ever. I have something for you, Darius said, his voice carrying a note of excitement. Elena pulled back to look at him. What kind of something? The kind that requires you to close your eyes. Elena laughed but obeyed, letting Darius guide her to what felt like the window seat in their private sitting room. She heard the rustle of paper, then Darius's hands on hers. You can look now. Eleanor opened her eyes to find herself holding an official document bearing the royal seal. As she read, her breath caught. A charter, she whispered, for a network of healing sanctuaries all across the 3 kingdoms. Every woman who needs sanctuary will have a place to go, Darius explained, his voice warm with pride. Funded by the crown, staffed by healers you'll train personally. Your work here expanded to help as many people as possible. Elena stared at the document, tears blurring her vision. When she'd been running through the darkness 3 years ago, she never could have imagined this, a life where her pain could become purpose, where her healing could help others heal. This is incredible, she managed, but Darius, the cost is nothing compared to the value of what you're building, he said firmly. Elena, you've turned your greatest wound into your greatest strength. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? Elena set the charter aside and turned to face her husband fully. This man who'd seen her at her most broken and called her brave, who'd waited patiently while she learned to trust, who'd given her a crown without ever asking her to change who she was. I love you, she said simply. For this, for everything, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "I love you too," Darius replied, pulling her close. "My brave, brilliant, beautiful queen." As the afternoon sun streamed through their windows and the sounds of the healing centre drifted up from the gardens below, Elena felt a profound sense of completion. She'd run from darkness and found light. She'd hidden from power and learned to wield it with compassion. She'd been afraid to trust and discovered that love, real love, was always worth the risk. Her story had started with fear and flight, but it would continue with purpose and partnership, healing and hope, and she couldn't wait to see what they would build together. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts about Elena's journey from fear to love. Her story reminds us that healing is possible, that patient love can overcome even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most broken places in our hearts become the source of our greatest strength. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free and it helps more people hear these stories of healing love that prove fairy tales can come true, even for those who've forgotten how to believe in them.